A very good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Chloe Tetro, the coaching lead here with Ready Care. For today, ahead of Type 2 Diabetes Week in Ireland, we'll be looking at Type 2 early signs and prevention. So methods to stop it in its tracks, how to see that it is on the tracks, and if you do have it, just a few little lifestyle and primarily dietary tips to help you manage and hopefully get yourself back into the normal HbA1c range. So type 2 is exceedingly common all over the world. It's massive epidemic tied to metabolic health changes. But here in the UK and Ireland, 1 in 5 adults have type 2 diabetes. Now, the good thing is it is largely preventable. In the previous paradigm, it was thought that once you had pre-diabetes or diabetes, it was a chronic progressive illness and there was nothing you could do about it. So I'm hoping to change your mind in today's session. So what we'll do is we'll cover what type 2 diabetes is. We'll look at the early detection markers there and just to really have a look at what these are, how they show themselves, and the link, right, how they're all linked to one another. And finally, we'll look at lifestyle, particularly dietary changes to help you manage your blood sugars and insulin. So what is type 2? So it's a condition where the body can't use insulin effectively, and that leads to high blood sugar levels. Now, normally when we eat carbohydrates, they break down into glucose, which insulin would then help to move into our cells. Now, in type 2 and in pre-diabetes, the cells become insulin resistant. So they become resistant to that little signal that's happening. So imagine the cell lock becoming quite rusty and the insulin, the key, isn't working properly anymore. So as a result, sugar builds up in the blood. Over time, this causes more serious complications, things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It can lead to heart disease, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes, of course, been hugely linked to each other. Vision loss, pins and needles, and down the line, potentially loss of limbs. So it's usually linked. Type 2 is usually linked to lifestyle, and it typically, not always, but typically will develop in and around kind of, 30s, 40s and later into life. But increasingly that number is coming down. So the key with all of this really is insulin. Insulin is the master hormone. So it does more than regulate blood sugars. It's a master metabolic hormone with widespread effects throughout the body. So it's secreted by the pancreas in response to that rising glucose levels. That insulin then helps the glucose to be shuttled into the cells, so primarily into your muscle and your fat, where it will be used for energy or stored as glycogen or fat. So when insulin function is impaired, like in insulin resistance, the body then has to produce more insulin to keep the blood sugar in check. So that's where the name coming in. It's resistant to that signal. It's no longer sensitive. Big pileup of insulin in the system. So this hyperinsulinemia, which is that chronically elevated insulin level, usually precedes and predicts type 2 diabetes by many years. So studies suggest that insulin resistance actually can be present up to a decade before diabetes is ever looked at. Now, what are the effects of this insulin resistance? So major one is cardiovascular system and blood pressure difficulties. So high insulin levels increase the renal sodium retention. So it basically, there's a greater blood volume and raised blood pressure. Insulin also activates the sympathetic nervous system and elevates the heart rate by promoting vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction, the constriction of your blood vessels. So that chronically high insulin level contributes to endothelial dysfunction. So the endothelial cells that will be around your blood vessels inflammation and arterial stiffness, which would all be huge precursor to arteriosclerosis and lead to hypertension. So oftentimes individuals that are battling with blood pressure and hypertension, and it doesn't particularly seem to be changed by some of the pharmacological usual steps that would change it. There can be oftentimes a link with insulin. Now, that being when all of the other signs or many of the other signs are there with it. So another way that it can impact is through liver and fat creation, or what's called as de novo lipogenesis. So another very common condition that we see through our work here is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD. The reason for that being is insulin promotes fat synthesis in the liver by activating enzymes and fatty acid synthase. So when glycogen stores are full, right, that should be circulating, but the lock and the key aren't working, that excess glucose is converted into fat, leading to fat accumulation around the liver. So that is the kind of primary driver to that non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And it's highly correlated with the insulin resistance and can sometimes progress to liver inflammation, fibrosis, and cirrhosis of the liver. Now, the high insulin levels will also impact your blood lipids, so your cholesterol and triglycerides. It will basically stimulate the liver to produce more very dense lipoproteins. So it increases what's called your circulating triglycerides. Now, a simpler way to say that is it starts to wreak havoc with your cholesterol markers. It inhibits your usual breakdown of your triglycerides in the bloodstream, and it will increase your triglycerides. So you have your three component parts. You've got your HDL, LDL, and triglycerides. It will decrease the HDL, the one that's doing lots of very positive jobs around the body. And it will increase your triglycerides, which is one of the component parts of your cholesterol figure that's directly implicated with cardiovascular risk. So there'll be things like adipose tissue around the body is going to go up. We see that through weight gain. That can't particularly be explained through changes of diet, changes of lifestyle. You're just noticing that your adipose tissue is starting to go up. So the visceral fat, the fat around your midsection is starting to go up. There can be some difficulty with your small blood vessels, which you'll start to see as neuropathy and retinopathy in and around the bladder. So your hands, your feet can get a little bit, retinopathy in and around the eyes, not the bladder, in and around the eyes. So the small blood vessels in your body will start to be damaged by that high insulin levels. And that will cause the kind of hand itching, foot itching, that kind of feeling of pins and needles that oftentimes people start to notice, and their vision can start to become a little bit blurry because all of those tiny blood vessels that are making up the eyes, the feet, the hands are starting to get damaged. Now, another one we see a lot is polycystic ovarian syndrome, which I have some full videos on for those of you interested. But essentially, polycystic ovarian syndrome is also implicated in high levels of insulin. So you can start to see and build a picture of why early detection is so important, and why seeing the kind of fuller picture of how things can interplay with each other. So the body is like a tree. It's like lots of different things, but for the sake of this analogy, it's like a tree where all these different branches are all connected to the one trunk, right? You are the one individuals with lots of different systems. So it's a good idea to start to see lots of these things, not as these totally disparate conditions that have nothing to do with one another, but as one story, excuse me, one story of a sneeze, one story of insulin starting to become an issue in the body. So pre-diabetes then is kind of an intermediate stage. It's an intermediate stage between the fairly arbitrary number of 48 in your HbA1c testing and above being diabetic, and 42 to 48 being pre-diabetic. So pre-diabetic rests in the kind of warning period, right? If you're to think of it like a traffic light system, green 42 and below, orange 42 to 48, 48 and above, red zone. But in saying that, pre-diabetes is not a separate condition. You're looking at one continuum, right? It is the beginning stages. It's diabetes happening. It's the starting points of diabetes happening. They're not two separate things that will become, a whole other condition. It's one spectrum that you're looking at. So that's something to keep in mind if you find yourself on that pre-diabetic route, that it is diabetes happening, not separate conditions. So this makes that intermediate stage, it's often driven by high insulin levels long before your blood glucose will actually start to rise. So there is the HbA1c testing and the blood glucose fasting tests there, but it can make them quite lagging indicators. So by the time these rise, insulin has usually been elevated for quite a number of years, and it will start to reshape your body's internal environment. So in that regard, the early detection stages are really crucial. So firstly, high insulin levels push the pancreas into overdrive, and this there's an attempt to compensate for that increased insulin resistance in your muscle, liver, and fat tissue. In this state, blood glucose can remain deceptive for years, even as damage is starting to happen. So your insulin suppresses fat breakdown. So it promotes fat storage, particularly in the visceral area. So when individuals start to notice that their weight is going up, that can be a huge teller sign that the insulin isn't particularly where it needs to be. It can also drive up hunger. It can drive up not feeling full after meals, because insulin will disrupt your hunger hormone and your satiation hormones. So if you're finding yourself with a little bit of gathering weight around the midsection, if you're finding yourself, feeling hungrier than you've ever been, you're not satiated by your meals, there's this kind of up and down, that can often be one of the telling signs that your insulin isn't quite where it should be. Now, overall, there's lots of different prevention styles for type 2 and pre-diabetes. The most effective one is looking at the root cause, which of course is that difficulty with the insulin. Now, as I've mentioned, insulin rises as a way to kind of counterbalance the breakdown of carbohydrates into glucose, right? The insulin is there to help to regulate the glucose levels in the body. So looking at a kind of reverse engineering of that mechanism and looking at what is causing the insulin to go all over the place in the first place, and is there something that can be done about root cause? So the best way is through root cause and looking at diet. So these particular interventions can reduce your risk by up to 50%, I would say even more. So one important topic in and of itself that I want to say, because I mentioned the weight being one of the teller aspects, that insulin's a little bit all over the place, and this is kind of a myth, or maybe not a myth, but a misconception, I suppose, is that weight in itself isn't actually the direct cause of diabetes, right? So oftentimes people are told you have pre-diabetes and diabetes because you've put on weight. Now, instead, weight gain, especially around the waist, as I've mentioned, is often a symptom of underlying insulin resistance. So when insulin is chronically elevated, like we've mentioned, that signal is going to inhibit fat burning and to create more fat in the body. So when the body is beginning to accumulate that fat, particularly around the abdomen, it's not that the weight is causing the diabetes, but because the insulin resistance is already present and it's disturbing that normal metabolism. So focusing solely on weight sometimes can be quite misleading. And why I mentioned that there's a few different avenues that are out there to help with, pre-diabetes and diabetes reversal. Oftentimes diet comes into it, but the type of diet is hugely, hugely important. What matters most here is metabolic health, how well your body manages glucose and insulin. So many people with even, kind of quote unquote normal weight will still develop type 2. They don't always go hand in hand with each other. But the types of foods and the types of dietary approaches that you take are very normal, because if we look at what's the leading cause here, right? If we're looking at that breakdown of the glucose, if we're looking at that raising the signal of the insulin, that insulin causing difficulty, essentially the types of foods that you're focusing on are hugely important. And the types of foods that break down to glucose can be used in a kind of run-of-the-mill weight loss program, things like your rice, things like pasta, like fruit. But where insulin and hormones are involved, this can kind of cause like a faux ami, like a false friend effect, where you could be losing weight, but you may not really be doing any good to the body from an insulin perspective. It could be exacerbating the condition down the line and seem like things are, going all in the right direction, because the body is losing weight through either massive calorie deficit or, specific foods not being in there. So the real key here is the types of foods. So primarily, the best long-term approach for this is a low carbohydrate approach. Now, that being because a low carbohydrate approach limits the carbohydrate intake that will then break down into sugars and starches and then raise your insulin. So you're really limiting that part of the mechanism being called into play. So reducing them will massively, massively help to regulate blood sugar and insulin levels. So you're cutting out things, not totally, it's not a zero carbohydrate, but even bringing these down and being discerning about when you have specific carbohydrates. Do they need to be at every single meal? Not particularly, not at all. In fact, you'd be much better off with non-starchy vegetables, proteins like meat, fish, eggs, or even some of the vegetarian types of proteins like tempeh, tofu. Proteins and healthy fats will have almost no sugar effect, right? If you're to look at carbohydrates, you'll have a spike and a crash, and a spike and a crash. Protein, you'll have a little bit of what's known as a pulsatile effect, and fats, almost nothing at all. So here you can see the types of foods will have a massive, massive impact on the blood sugar spikes, and as a result, on the insulin that's being produced. So cutting back on carbohydrate type foods will help to regulate your blood sugar day in, day out. And when you look at the test, the blood test done for, seeing which aspect of that category you're in, whether it's the normal range, the pre-diabetic range, or the diabetic range, that HbA1c blood test is a 3-month snapshot. So it's going to look at 3 months of your day in, day out, and do a little figure to show you where on that spectrum you're landing. So making sure that your day in, day out, and it doesn't need to be every single day. People have special occasions, they have meals out of the house, they have being caught where there's nothing else available. So it's not that you absolutely have to go zero carbohydrates or anything like that. What you're looking to do is reduce the load on your system in that breakdown of carbohydrate-rich foods to sugar, bouncing up the insulin. So it sounds pretty, it makes sense when it's heard out. So essentially the main foods to avoid will be things like grains, right? And even though whole grains and porridge are not bad foods by any stretch means of the imagination, they're not. When there's insulin difficulties, they aggravate the problem, right? So it's not that I have a war on fields of grain or anything like that, or trying to demonize any specific foods. But in the same way that if you had a dairy intolerance, it wouldn't be out of this world to maybe say, okay, maybe cut back on your dairy a little bit, maybe less yogurts and ice creams and, pints of milk over the day. It's not that extreme of an idea, really. So it's looking at reducing the foods that are keeping your body in a state where it's unwell. And remember, it's not just the blood sugar, it's the impact to the liver health, the hypertension, the cholesterol, and the signalers to cardiovascular disease that we're trying to keep in check. So less of those foods, the grains, the porridge, rice, even if they're brown versions. And that's another misconception sometimes is, a whole meal version might break down ever so slightly slower, but it's still breaking down in the system. It might be better than a white version of a roll, but no roll is the best option, or a roll made of low carb ingredients. It's like saying, would you prefer one slap across the face or two slaps across the face? You say, well, one slap is better, I should have one slap every single day. And you think, maybe having none might be a better alternative. I'm being a bit silly, but driving home the point that just because something is marketed as a healthier option, healthier does not mean healthiest. And things like, even the kind of super grains that were all over social media a while back, things like quinoa, buckwheat. It's not that they're bad foods. It's just that while you're trying to look after this particular problem that is caused by these types of foods, you're better off avoiding them. Potatoes and sweet potatoes, again, best to avoid them as much as possible. Don't have to cut them out altogether forever and ever, but just to keep an eye on them. And any above ground vegetable is going to be absolutely fine. You're looking at courgettes, peppers, tomatoes, green beans. All of these are absolutely fine. Don't even worry about them. Have as much of those as possible. Good proteins, good fats. Breakfast options usually become, 2 eggs, few rashers, or big bowl of Greek yogurt with a little bit of stevia through it if you don't like the taste, berries, nuts, even a little grating of dark chocolate, flax seeds, chia, whatever you fancy. Big salads, lots of meat and 2 veg or meat and 3 veg like people used to eat, or again, the vegetarian option of those. So why does it work? It works because it's essentially breaking that system. It's putting a halt to that systematic breakdown of that glucose, rising the insulin. So lots and lots of studies out there. There's a 2020 systematic review in the MJ found that low carb diets improved HbA1c, fasting insulin, and body weight more than low fat diets by a mile in people with type 2 diabetes. And another study in 2018 in Nutrition and Metabolism showed that low carb diets reduce fasting insulin by 1/3 in just 12 weeks. So 12 weeks is that kind of time window you want to be looking at for if you were to get a blood test before and a blood test after to see where you're at in that HbA1c range. 12 weeks is kind of the sweet spot with it. So low carb diets, basically, to summarize, will lower your blood glucose and HbA1c. They lower your fasting insulin. They'll reduce the need for medications, of course, which is a conversation to have with your GP if you are currently on type 2 medication. It will help with sustained weight loss and improve metabolic markers. So it's a huge, huge hope for lots of people that might have previously been told, once you have it for life, that's it, goodbye. It's only going to be more medication and, eventually moving on to insulin injections or what have you. Now, that is not the case anymore. Time and time over again, we see that for lots of people, not all, every person, has their individual medical history, but for most people that have pre-diabetes and diabetes, as well as the conditions that I mentioned, things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, cholesterol difficulties, blood pressure difficulties, polycystic ovarian syndrome, all in the family of insulin resistance. That low carbohydrate approach demonstrates huge, huge positive differences in a very, very short window of time. So in terms of recapping the major kind of early detection, any of the conditions that are implicated with insulin resistance, if you're seeing, okay, I'm seeing a few of those in there, that can be a telling sign. Weight gain that you can't account for. Things that your diet may not have changed particularly, your activity hasn't particularly changed, and you're seeing the weight creep up. Now, the middle-age spread isn't real. I mean, it's real if we look out there, but it's not a physiological thing that people just, put on weight as they get older. And oftentimes these conditions are just called conditions of aging. That's not the case. Most often than not, it's the insulin that's implicated in there. So appetite going all over the place, be it that you have no appetite 1 minute, starving the next, always hungry, can't fill up, or get totally full and you're starving very, very shortly after. That can be a sign that your insulin is starting to confuse the messaging of your ghrelin and leptin with your hunger and satiation hormones. For women, difficulties happening with their hormonal cycle, implicated with polycystic ovarian syndrome. If the blood pressure is starting to come up and you're not too sure, you're not particularly stressed, not more than usual, but it's starting to creep up, and finding things like itchiness in around the hands, feet, vision becoming a little bit more difficult, and needing to get up quite often in the nighttime to go to the loo. Same thing, that's all your very small blood vessels in your body starting to get a little bit damaged by that insulin. So all things to look out for. And majorly, the big takeaway here is that all of these things can be managed, looked after, and put right back in the right direction with a low-carb approach. Medication, if that's what's needed for a period of time, if that's the conversation you've had with your GP, but in the pre-diabetic range, prior to getting onto any medication, that's a very, very sweet spot through diet alone, to get yourself right back out there and into the normal range. Right. I hope you found that helpful. And any questions, as always, love to receive them in the comment section. And we will see you guys next week. And I don't know why I popped my name up there just randomly. Remember me. And any questions, please do make sure to pop them in the comment section. And we'll see you next week. Bye now.